couple of weeks ago, we talked with Dr. DeLon Canterbury about overmedication in seniors. This was a really popular episode and really struck a chord with people. It's something we've personally experienced with our own clients at ClearPath, and we were so honored to be able to do that episode. I was also really taken by Dr. DeLon's personal story, so I asked him to come back on the show. I'm your host, Valerie Borgman, and today, Dr. DeLon is sharing the story of his grandmother, who was overmedicated in a care setting, causing a very difficult journey for her and their entire family. So join us as Dr. DeLon shares the inspiration for his company, GeriatRX, his grandma, Mildred. Welcome to Desperately Seeking Senior Living, a podcast for sons, daughters, grandkids, and spouses who suddenly find themselves tangled in the search for senior living and care. If you like today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and check out our doable download in today's show notes for a printable summary of the show and a bonus tip from our guest. You're listening to our doable tips, short answers to your questions. Don't see your question listed? Send us a note. Then don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an answer.
A lot of why I'm here today actually began with my grandma, Mildred. She essentially was who I had in mind when I developed geriatrics and really talking about deprescribing in particularly our dementia patients, but in our seniors in general. So with my grandma, she lived to see 90 years old, God bless, which is, a very full life. And, she had about 11 kids in Guyana in South America. And
Wow.
that was kind of the norm there, was to just have a bunch of kids and just move on with the legacy of raising a family.
And hope that all those kids, someone's going to take care of you, right?
Yeah, essentially.
One of them's going to pull through.
that one who did was my mom. So my mom was to pull it through. And essentially, as she started having some behavior changes while she was in New York, we had to worry about coordination of care and who's getting power of attorney, et cetera. And my uncle at the time was in charge. But really, the ugly side of the story was when her conditions worsened while she was in that nursing home, right? Like, she started having more of those symptoms of irritability. She was lethargic. She was just really confused. She really didn't know who was talking to her most of the time. And, no one wants to ever see that, but we had to agree that she needed some type of help. And so they put her in a nursing home.
So at the time, was she diagnosed with dementia or Alzheimer's?
No, she wasn't diagnosed with anything. She had some mild dementia, which was noticeable, but no diagnosis. They didn't have really a diagnosis for anything for her. Maybe the dementia, but ultimately it wasn't really well managed, It wasn't well managed at all. So that's where the ugly side of it comes. And really, she's a pretty smart, snazzy woman. She's really well put together, super, super smart. But just seeing those changes in her in that home just worsened everything. And it was a bit heartbreaking. I think I was maybe my second year. No, I was like a third or fourth year college student applying to pharmacy school. So I wasn't even, like a pharmacist yet per se. I was clueless, to the meds. I just knew that my grandma was back at home. And so as her symptoms declined in this nursing home, the provider there wrote a prescription to try to treat some of her, I guess, dementia behavioral symptoms associated with her decline. That's some of her moodiness. Maybe she'd be fearful that nurses were stealing her stuff, or essentially would feel as if she wasn't being listened to and that they're trying to hurt her in some way. So it was always tough on her. And so the providers decided to give her a prescription for a med that we thought was, completely unnecessary. And so what was legally done with, I guess, good intentions, really to control her, actually led to her significant decline in her care. So her behaviors, her angry, her irritability, her confusion, all worsened while she was on this antipsychotic, which was ziprasidone or geodon. So you don't really see it as much anymore, but antipsychotics, unfortunately, are used frequently in these nursing homes and long-term care facilities. And usually it's inappropriate when they're being used. So that was the kicker in my journey in starting geriatrics, later down the road. But my grandma unfortunately got so bad with her symptoms that they could not manage her care. They decided to, unfortunately, kick her out. They just didn't want to deal with her, and she no longer was allowed to stay in that nursing home, sadly. And so this is where my parents had to move her from New York back to our family home in Atlanta. And so that was a bit taxing on them, as you can imagine, as two full-time parents, two caregivers, two full-time jobs, and essentially now having to re-raise my mom's mom. So that's never easy.
Yeah. The thing that came to my mind as you're talking about being kicked out of a skilled nursing facility is that a skilled nursing facility is like the highest level of care outside of a hospital.
Mm.
And so I can't even imagine what that was like for you guys.
Mm.
Like what was that initial thought?
Definitely a lot of panic and anger and frustration. And, here we are trying to navigate this system, and we're paying you to take care of, or trusting you, more importantly, we're paying you and trusting you to have the best intentions, enacted for her and for Mildred. And it's kind of heartbreaking seeing that that's uncontrollable when you're in a setting that's kind of designed to control that. So that was a bummer, but to say the least, it was frustrating. It was damn frustrating to see my parents go through this, and now have to figure out, how are we going to get a caregiver? How are we going to get, Medicare to pay for someone to come and visit her at home?
Your mom initially brought her back to their home?
Absolutely. Absolutely. While she was a teacher full time in Atlanta public schools, and when my dad was a full time business owner as well with his accounting business. So, luckily he did that because he had the flexibility to tend to her as needed, but we still had to get some type of home health aid in the beginning before eventually transitioning her into a small setting nursing home to assist with that. So again, very taxing on the family.
So she was in that skilled nursing environment and they made that med change to the antipsychotic and then
Mm.
caused these issues and
Mhm.
they were like we can't handle this and then now you've got her at home.
Yeah.
At what point did someone take a look at that medication? And what were her behaviors?
My grandma was pretty notorious for having symptoms very similar to what's seen in Parkinson's with sundowning. Essentially, around 3 or 4, you become just very agitated, confused. It's like your symptoms worsen. A full moon would always worsen her symptoms. That just was always the truth. And essentially, she was irritable, angry, and confused. The main one being confusion, just didn't know who she was talking to. She would think she was talking to, one of her other 11 kids she once had, or dead kids, or again, didn't have the time and spatial awareness. And so she was wandering out of our house and at home. She was wander out, ring the doorbell. She was found in the street one time. All in all, that burned my parents out. And so they had to find some extra help, but honestly, they didn't have anyone to get the medications until about 4 or 5 months of suffering. And that was upon a refill where they started telling the pharmacist, look, we're having issues at home. This isn't working for her. And that was when that shout out to that community pharmacist who took the time and found that this was an issue with that medication and advocated for us and was able to call and try to battle and get that medication stopped, which took about, a week or two. But in those week or two, if it wasn't for that pharmacist, I don't think my grandma would have lived to see 90. She was still chronically confused and irritable. And we were able to get her tapered off of that med, after about 2 weeks. And then she essentially got back to her normal self, like somehow confusion, but it was definitely way more clear. And She was able to have a conversation, knew who she was talking to, and it was night and day. It was simply night and day, and it was a breath of relief for my family.
Wow. I think it's so mind-blowing, and I think there are probably gonna be some of our listeners that are going to relate to this and maybe are even going through this right now, but it is so mind-blowing that
Yeah.
someone can be in a protected environment like a skilled nursing facility, which has doctors and nurses, that
Mhm.
are in that environment, and that someone could prescribe a medication and not realize in that protected environment that the medication was the issue. And
Right.
I know that's why you do what you do now. But it just is kind of scary
Mhm.
to think that you think you've got your loved one in a protected environment. Like you were saying,
Yeah.
you're supposed to take care of
Yeah.
my grandma. Like you're supposed to be the one, and then they're not the one.
Yeah. Not
And I think that's so mind-blowing. When now did the medication, was that changed before the move to Atlanta?
No, and I mean, honestly, it took the move to Atlanta. It took my parents having to live with her, and it took really that pharmacist and my mom begging the pharmacist to just see what is going on with her. Like, is anything wrong? Like, what can we do? And it was her instinct to advocate that led to the medication change. The pharmacist had already refilled it about 2 or 3 times at this point.
What was it like moving someone who is now on an antipsychotic, which is
Mhm,
causing all of these issues?
mhm.
What did that move look like from New York to Atlanta?
Yeah, yeah. Super stressful, super stressful. Moving someone out of their comfort zone, their environment, all unfortunately for their betterment, but really they were not in the headspace to know. They're just like more angry and more irritated. So I think my mom took a lot of biting the bullet on that because she's doing things and then feeling like she's not being appreciated for this. It was hell.
Was it a plane ride or a car ride?
Oh no, we drove her. If anything, I know my dad would have done the driving, and he would have gone up there and then taken her down and gotten her stuff and moved her in. From there, I think my mom had to kind of face some of her traumas, like that kind of resurfaced and indirectly from my grandma just not being aware of what she's saying. So I think there were a lot of steps to overcome. But it was difficult. It was difficult. Even in our home, she wasn't necessarily comfortable. She still felt like she was under attack or someone was trying to steal her stuff and she was in a nursing home still. So she would still act as if she had to be on guard. I mean, she's hit her dentures twice and those are expensive. She hit her glasses a couple times or lost them. And getting those remade again is a cost prohibitive. My sister, who helped out more because she was more around since I was in college. She was around to help out a bit more than I could.
And how long did you say it was 4 months that
Yeah,
that your grandma lived with your parents?
yeah. It was about 4 months of the nightmares, and then they finally got the meds stopped, and she did better while she was in her nursing home. In fact, it got better, and this is a nursing home in Atlanta. It got better to the point where she actually wanted to go back to New York, and eventually she did go back to New York.
Really?
Yeah, she found another home that took her in and essentially aged gracefully there until she passed away a month after her 90th birthday to the T.
Wow.
So she actually died my very last day of pharmacy school.
Oh my
Yeah,
gosh. Wow.
yeah. But I was grateful to see her the month before to celebrate her 90th birthday. I think she spiritually held on to see everyone. And, it was a great birthday. She remembered everyone. She was sharp. She was witty. And yeah, she passed peacefully in her sleep a month later.
And I love how you dedicate what you do now to your
Mhm.
grandmother. And so that's kind of cool that she passed on that last day of
Mm,
school for you. That's really cool.
yeah. Yeah. You can't really forget that. And unfortunately, I mean, again, my very first patient was very similar to her case, over medicated, 36 meds. She was on an inappropriate antipsychotic. It was Seroquel for her, or quetiapine, and it caused her same confusion, much more confusion. But in fact, it was a bit worse in that she was so sedated, she just didn't really have a life. She was just kind of in the room drooling away. That's the person I'm speaking of when I mean we need to leverage pharmacists to advocate for our patients, and we need to use a more integrative approach to medication management. And I think de-prescribing is what needs to be required in our schooling and in these nursing homes. Not just one pharmacist who's looking at a long term care facility and they have to look at 200 beds and do a review. I mean, a systems wide change to reducing these harms with a team, with an interdisciplinary team that looks at this, because everyone has a role in prescribing, not just the doctor, not just the pharmacist, but everyone who's touching that patient.
Yeah. And, we've talked about this in your other episode where we talk specifically about over medication.
Yeah,
And it's so many things, right? It's being understaffed. It's not being able, like you're saying, to physically take the time that's necessary for each patient. It just is, it's just crazy to me that all of these things are happening. And I can't even imagine what your mom and dad went through. I can't even imagine.
yeah, I can't either. I can't either. Raising kids, having a business, having to respond to emergencies at the drop of a dime, which happen frequently. It's super hard. It's super hard. And so I saw the struggle they had. And, I felt powerless at the time because I wasn't quite a pharmacist and didn't really know what to say or advocate for. But I knew that this could not be the healthcare system that we as Americans are paying for. This is what our taxes are going towards, like literally sick care. And that's problematic. It's problematic, and it's morally and ethically compromising as a health professional to know other health professionals who have the same stories day in, day out. It's the same stories, and they can't even navigate it either. So it's just, it shouldn't be this hard. It shouldn't be this expensive. And I think there just needs to be funding that goes towards policy change, one, and reimbursement rates and whatnot. But we got to change the way this healthcare system delivers care. And we know it's killing us.
And hopefully, after hearing your story with your grandmother and, the other episode that we did, hopefully it also gives families more of a feeling of empowerment because, what happened with your mom at the pharmacy where she was finally, right, after months, got to the point to say, this isn't right. And hopefully, after listening to your story, it can help families to have that conversation before 4 months of craziness and,
Exactly.
horrible situations
Yeah.
where they feel like they actually have a right to say something is wrong. Because your mom and your dad, at that point of living with your grandmother, they knew her better than any doctor
Hmm.
because they were spending 24/7 with her.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what I hope that families get out of this is to know that you do know. You know your parents if you're spending that much time with them, and you know yourself
Hmm.
better than anybody else too.
Yeah.
And so I really hope that families get that from what we're talking about. Did your mom or your dad or your sister ever confide in you? What were those conversations like? Because I imagine you must have felt the pressure. Like you're the one in pharmacy school.
Yeah. My parents never wanted their kids to worry about things. So they would talk about it, but they weren't necessarily asking me for like clinical advice. They were still trying to manage it on their own. My sister definitely told me more when she was involved and stayed over a couple breaks and was helping mommy and granny around the house with what was going on and cleaning her, keeping her company, playing with her. And she felt it too. And it was just maybe for a couple of days, but she definitely felt that stress, that kind of burnout associated with it, and had to learn a new skill very quickly. You don't just teach caregiving. I mean, you can, but you don't just know it until you experience it. I think they were more worried about not worrying their kids. And so I'm in the middle of school And I think a part of them didn't want to put that burden on me. But I know they suffered because they told me a lot after the fact because, it's hard making that adaptation and managing care in a system that you never had to navigate like that.
Yeah, that is interesting. I what you said about caregiving because I just can't imagine being thrown into that situation and yeah, I mean, you're what I guess googling. You're like,
Essentially.
and then you add behaviors on top of that which are often refusing care. Is that something that your grandma did too?
She refused a lot of things. Yeah, she didn't even want certain people entering her room, because she thought you were a threat. So definitely probably along the lines of some hygiene, maybe not taking some of her pills, which probably would have been good in this situation. Those two are the main ones. She didn't really eat well because she's Caribbean. And so you want to cook food that she's accustomed to, a Caribbean food. And if you haven't noticed, a lot of the nursing home foods, if you're not paying high end, is pretty bland and not very nutritious. They actually have really low budgets for nutrition in these homes. So you're getting a bunch of canned, really not good stuff. So not only are we Caribbean and black, we got to have some flavor in our food. And if it's even if it's healthy, it's still flavored. So she just would not eat most of those types of foods unless it's familiar to her. So that's another learning piece as well. But yeah, there's a lot of gems from this, and I now wish I was more involved in the care. I had to learn secondhand and experience that pain, and it changed my philosophy around senior care and really the lack of advocacy that I think is missing. And that's why I have to tell and teach clinicians and other people how they can use deprescribing, how they can educate, how they can potentially leverage their senior care organization, whether it's a nursing home or daycare center, to provide this service because it shouldn't just be a pharmacist. I think we're important in this process, but we need everyone on board. We need everyone trained on board and willing to look at ways to stop this and see it as a team based effort.
I absolutely agree. So, Delon, what would be your number one doable tip for families just based on your experience with your grandma?
Ask for help, man. My parents were tough cookies and they run a lot of the work on themselves. So I feel it could have been easier had they had some more caregiver support groups, interactions, or knowing who was in their backyard who could be there, maybe getting involved with an elder care attorney. I will say, if you're worried about affairs, try to get things planned. Wills, advance directives, try to get those things done sooner than later if you start seeing your loved one decline. So you're not wondering what granny wants when things worsen, or you're fighting family members for things you don't want to fight about at the worst time. So I just say ask for help, lean on those resources. There are some amazing Facebook communities that have caregiver support, people of course like you, Valerie, who do this. Just don't be afraid and be sure to prioritize your mental health as a caregiver before your loved one. Because, I mean, you can't take care of someone if you're pouring from an empty cup.
This week's episode is brought to you by GeriatRX, a pharmacist led medication management company helping caregivers to stop their loved ones from being overmedicated through genetic testing, deprescribing, and health cost saving strategies. GeriatRX, your trusted consultant pharmacist. Find more information in today's show notes. Check out this episode's doable download in show notes for details, including industry terms and definitions we discussed, as well as a bonus tip from our guest. Have questions or your own tips to share? Leave us a message. We'd love to hear from you. And until next time, make it doable.